Welcome to my second lecture on socialism. Last time we discussed with you the major approaches I'm going to use in this course. We also discussed the major trends in socialism. We found out that originally in the 19th century, socialism was divided into two big factions, Marxian socialism and anarchism. Then anarchism was marginalized, and by the early 20th century, especially since the 19th split, we have two major new factions in socialism. It's social democracy and communism. We also discussed the differences between these two factions, communism and social democracy. We also addressed the content of this expression, socialism. Today, we are going to discuss the sources of this social and intellectual movement called socialism. We are going to discuss the historical background which gave rise to the philosophy of socialism. I will have to take you back into history. I will have to take you back to late Middle Ages. I will have to take you to early modern times. And go into the sources and historical background. I would like to emphasize four major items we're going to discuss in this respect. First, we will have to talk about the legacy of Reformation and those apocalyptic sects which emerged in the 1500s, 1600s, and survived and developed well into the 1700s. We will have to talk about the legacy of Enlightenment, so how Enlightenment contributed to the rise of socialism. We are going to discuss, strange as it may sound, the world of Freemasonry, because Freemasonry provided early intellectual and organizational shells for socialist groups. And finally, and most important, we are going to address the Industrial Revolution, which led to dislocations, to the collapse of traditional society, and produced new classes of people which defined the face of socialism. So let us start with the legacy of Reformation. If you took history courses, general history courses on Western civilization, on European history, and maybe some world history, told you about this religious changes and intellectual changes that took place during and in the wake of the Reformation were profound for the European history and for the history of the world. You know, briefly for you, that Reformation was the split between two big factions of Christians in Europe. 1517, German monk Martin Luther revolted against the power of the Catholic Pope, challenged him, and eventually the entire continent of Europe became divided, roughly. Northern part, which became Protestant, and Southern Europe, which remained Roman Catholic. So the unity of Christians was gone. The world of Reformation throughout the 1500s and throughout the 1600s was the world filled with the religious doubts, or spiritual doubts, better to say. When people were fighting each other about the religion, when people were killing each other about the religion. And for a lot of grassroots folks, and not necessarily grassroots folks, for many educated people, the whole conflict was interpreted as the end of the world. A lot of people viewed this profound religious conflict as the end of the world, okay? When Christians were killing Christians. So we have a bunch of apocalyptic sects emerging in the course of the Reformation that preached the end of the world. Okay. A few words about the Protestant movement that was triggered by Martin Luther. You remember that Protestant movement, those people who protested against the power of the Roman Pope, they wanted to simplify church services. They wanted to, as Martin Luther said, to return Christians to their roots, to make them humble, to make them forget about these luxurious lifestyles which were practiced by contemporary Roman popes. Roman popes were thinking frequently about the art, sciences, their land, how to protect the power. So there was not much room for spirituality. Okay, and that's what upset a lot of Protestants who said we don't need decorations, we don't need Catholic statutes. So we have this woke, I'm using the modern day expression, woke crowd. A lot of Protestants were running around smashing Catholic statutes, decorations, desecrating decorations, and eventually the whole Protestant movement was launched as the movement to destroy this vital center. We do not need centralized power, okay, the power of the Roman Pope, when all Christians were controlled from one center. Okay, so we have a bunch of Protestant groups which not only challenged the Roman Pope, but they challenged each other. They were fighting with each other. Okay, we have a numerous denominations. So those of you who might be Methodist and Baptist or Unitarians, Presbyterians, so all these denominations, they their roots could be traced to originally to Martin Luther. Okay, Protestant Reformation. So no vital center. But what is important for us here is the major gist, the major message of Protestant Reformation was to move away from the church power and to do what? To read the Bible. So the Bible was put at the center of the Protestant movement. So everything was focused on the book. The book was the center, not decorations, not statutes, not ceremonial services, not what your priest had to say, but the Bible. So to make a long story short, people in Northern Europe became voracious readers. Voracious readers. They were reading the Bible like crazy, and of course we have the rise of the mass education. Okay. Now, by the way, Puritans who came here to North America, Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, 95% of them were educated people. Women, men, children who knew how to read and to write because it was encouraged in the families, because they needed to read the Bible. Okay. But in response to Protestant propaganda, we have counter-reformation, when Catholic Church also started to encourage Catholic education, to indoctrinate people in the spirit of loyalty to the Roman Pope. Okay, so we have a bunch of Catholic schools being founded. We have the emergence of so-called the Jesuit order. If you know the history of Jesuits, they put a great emphasis on education. So a bunch of universities were set up by Jesuits, but it was to be Catholic universities, Catholic propaganda. But what we're interested in this case is the general rise of a pool of educated people in Europe, especially Northern Europe, where the emphasis was on the Bible. So we have the rise in literacy among the Europeans, unlike the other areas of the world. Okay. Why is it so important for us? Again, I'm jumping ahead because later in socialism, reading, quote unquote, sacred books of socialism, it could be books of secular people, it could be books of secular people like Marx and Engels, who were atheists, it could be books of utopian socialists, whom we are going to discuss next time on Thursday. But still, these were the texts, okay? Sacred texts. printed by socialists. And this respect for the word, for the text, it was the origin of this tradition goes back to this Protestant Reformation. Again, at first it was the Bible, and then when society became, at least part of society became secularized, it was a bunch of secular books which came to replace the Bible with the rise of atheism. Okay, so mark for yourself this important moment, the rise of universal literacy, especially among rich people, of course, aristocrats, middle-class people, and in towns, especially in towns, among craftsmen and some peasants as well. Don't discount the peasants, because they also tried to be voracious readers, tried to learn how to read and to write. Okay. Another thing is important. When the Reformation started, we have a bunch of groups that debated spirituality. People were thinking about how we're going to be saved. So what is the final word we have to listen to? Who is the primary authority? Okay. To Martin Luther, the primary authority was the Bible. Okay. When the Catholic Church said, oh, you need to listen to the Roman Pope, but Martin Luther said, no, it's only the Bible. Go back to the roots, to the sacred books of the founders. The word of Jesus Christ, it's the Bible. So he was focused on the Bible. But some people went further. They said it's not enough. Bible is good, but it's not enough. You need to go deeper. You need to go to your heart, because your faith is something that is located in your heart. Okay, and to be saved, it's not enough to read the Bible, the Word of God. So you have to feel it. Okay. You have to suffer for it. You have to have this inner revelation. Okay, and that's when we have various apocalyptic sects and movements emerging during the Reformation. Okay, I chose one of the most important ones. This movement headed by a German teacher and theologian named Thomas Müntzer, who led the peasant revolt in Germany, okay, in 1524, 1525. But there were many other sects. What Martin Luther said originally was taken further and further. Martin Luther was one of the Lutherans. At that time, there was not yet a Lutheran church. There were followers of Lutheran, but Martin Luther decided, Thomas Müntzer suggested that we go further than Martin Luther. We by taking Bible as the source, we have to go beyond Bible. We have to go to our heart to feel the faith in our hearts. Okay. So the true belief was dictated by your spiritual experience, not by the written testimony. Okay. Not the word, but your faith, your feeling. Okay. By the way, there were many radical Protestants at that time who actually repudiated Martin Luther for not being consistent enough in his preaching. Martin Luther said, fighting against, see, interesting point, what I'm just saying, very interesting. Please pay attention to this. When Martin Luther challenged the Roman Pope, he said, you are not the only source of power in your cardinals or your priests. He said, every man is a minister. That's what Martin Luther said. Any man is a minister. So basically, the message was that any man could pick up the Bible and he can go and preach the Bible. But there was a sect named Anabaptists, okay, who said, okay, Martin Luther, so you said every man could be a minister. What about women? They said they also can read and interpret the Bible. Oh, I didn't mean it. This and that. So anyway, Anabaptists also held him responsible for not being consistent enough. When Martin Luther said we need to drop this communion, confession, it's ridiculous. But at the same time, Martin Luther said we need to keep two sacraments, Only two sacraments: baptism and last rites. That's it. So all other sacraments we need to draw. But people said, and the Baptist, for instance, why do we need to baptize little children? They cannot decide yet what church they should belong to. Okay, we should wait until they're 16 years, when they're adult enough, old enough to decide what denominations they should belong to. So, by the way, that is why they how they got their name, and the Baptists. Okay, so they were against infant baptisms, and they defended adult baptism and the Baptist, and they also wanted to give right to female preachers to go and preach. Okay, and Thomas Müntzer belonged to the same group of people who wanted to radicalize the message that had been originally issued by Martin Luther. Okay, so Thomas Müntzer at first agreed with Martin Luther, but then he said, "Oh, you don't talk enough about spiritual experience." Basically, Thomas Müntzer started arguing that a true Christian is the one who experiences Christianity deep inside his heart. What does it mean? It means we have to suffer. People who suffer, who are in pain, they can become true Christians. Okay, people who enjoy the life, who don't have any troubles, who don't have any miseries, so they cannot be good Christians. That was the message. Okay, by suffering pain and by being victims of something, through our dreams and visions, we can experience God, and we can receive revelations. We can become true Christians. Basically, you see what was the next step he logically took, that the poor people, peasants, plebeians, craftsmen, grassroots, common people, these were the ones who were close to God because they suffered, they were in pain, not the rich princes or some merchants. Okay, Thomas Müntzer, who is sometimes called the first organized socialist, which is not true. I will tell you about this. He formulated, spelled out his ideas in so-called the Prague Manifesto, 1521. Okay, he was at first kicked out from Germany when Martin Luther was not accepted. It was not widely accepted yet, and he found escape to Prague, where he preached for a while. Then he had to escape from Prague back to Germany, and that's where he raised people in revolt. Okay, Thomas Müntzer. As I said, sometimes Thomas Müntzer is considered by some writers as the one of the first socialists, which is not correct. Okay, and this argument goes back to Friedrich Engels, one of the founders of Marxism, who wrote a book called The Peasant War in Germany, where he glorified Thomas Müntzer, calling him like a forerunner of socialism, like a predecessor of socialism, is this natural socialist. Okay, other later writers stretched it further and said, "Oh, he was first socialist." There is a good book written by a Russian intellectual, Igor Shafarevich, called The Socialist Phenomenon, by Igor Shafarevich, 1981, where the first two chapters deal with these type of movements. Okay, eschatological movements or religious apocalyptic movements in early modern times, which he called socialist movements. But again, as I told you last time, we can talk about these people as forerunners or people who created background for later socialism, but of course they were not socialists. Why? Because they were not working in the secular matrix. Okay, they still were working in the Christian paradigm. Okay, They were in Christian paradigm and they were Christians, so we cannot call them socialists. But they did create these prerequisites, okay? Because without these prerequisites, we wouldn't have socialism, later socialism. So your true faith comes from your inner spiritual suffering and despair, okay? And another second part of his teaching, of his agenda, was this apocalyptic vision of the world. He said that we are close to the end of the world. The world is going to hell, okay? And the task of the true believers to help God to usher in a new world, new era in history, okay? The new world, which will be golden, good world, the world of prosperity, okay? See this message, okay? He had very radical supporters. In fact, they were very violent, okay? At some point, he radicalized them so much. As I said, the Protestants in general were very much radicalized, okay? They didn't destroy the church buildings, but what they did, they destroyed the Catholic statutes, monuments, decorations, cleansing buildings from decorations, and turning them into like simplified preacher houses. Like, if you know by now, if you are a Baptist or belong to some other Protestant denominations, you normally would have a building, a room with empty walls, right? Empty walls, seats, and the Bible at the podium, and that's it. So they simplified the kind of humble, simple approach to preaching. It goes back to that time of Protestant Reformation. Compare this with Catholic Church, where everything is so beautiful, beautiful vestments, decorations, this communion, confession, rituals, a lot of rituals. So emphasis on rituals. So you will not see this in many, not in all, but in many Protestant denominations. You will never see this. Anyway, but some of the Protestants at that time were radical. They even destroyed the church buildings. For instance, supporters of Thomas Müntzer, they burned down a small chapel in Malerbach, Germantown, southern Germantown, okay? And they banded with these Anabaptists whom I mentioned before. Thomas Müntzer created his own organization called the Eternal League of God, okay? They called themselves the elect, these members of this league. They said that the end of the world is coming, and we, the elect, we should lead this revolt. Revolt against whom? Against the rich people, princes, who are not going to be saved because they're rotten people, they're rich, they don't suffer, okay? And the peasants were rising against princes, against rich people in southern Germany, 1524, 1525. So he comes, and he and a few of his friends were put in charge by peasants, and they led this brief peasant war that was suppressed by princes. And Martin Luther himself condemned Thomas Müntzer, denounced him. And since German princes had a well-trained army, they defeated these peasants. So that was suppressed, this peasant revolt. So here you see the images of this peasant revolt, and that they had a interesting flag with a rainbow and with this inscription. I don't remember exactly. It's something about we are for the word of God, something like this. So see that. But Reformation, it was not only about what I just told you, the rise of this egalitarian eschatological sects that preached revolt, the end of the world, and only people who suffer can be saved. Okay, without suffering, without pain, you cannot be a good Christian. So that was the preaching of these pre-socialist sects, apocalyptic sects. As I said, reading and mass literacy, that was another important part of the Reformation. Okay, so among Protestants, we have Bible readings, discussions, different interpretations of the Bible. Okay, so we have so many groups of Protestants. Remember this concept that survived to the present day, that people in many Protestant denominations, for instance, those of we're in the South, you know about Baptists, very popular here. So Baptists actually can set up a Bible study group, right, to discuss the Bible and things like that. In the Catholic Church, there has been no such tradition, because, in fact, Bible reading was not encouraged in Catholic Church. I don't know about these days, but in before the 1900, it wasn't encouraged. So listen to your priest, okay? That's it. But here in Protestant tradition, we have the rise of culture of debates. See, that's a very important, the culture of debates. And when you have different interpretations of the Bible, arguments, conflicts, how we need to interpret the Bible. See, you naturally see their gradual rise of skepticism. Okay, what I want to show you one of the pages of so-called the Geneva Bible, published by the followers of John Calvin. John Calvin, another famous Protestant theologian. Reason I decided to show you this page from the Geneva Bible, and this particular copy was published in 1560, is to show you, to draw your attention that it was not only the text of the Bible, okay? It was the text that it was accompanied by a bunch of, we would say, endnotes and footnotes or side notes. You see here, side notes. Basically, Geneva Bible gave you different notes, different pieces of advice, comments on how you should interpret particular passages of the Bible. When the Bible said about the life of Christians, some comments in the Geneva Bible said how you're going to elect your leaders, you know, how you should organize, how you should do debates. So basically, the Word of God was interpreted by human beings. Okay, no wonder that later King James hated it, because he believed that such a Bible could be very subversive, because it has a lot of interpretations. It has not only the text, but a bunch of cliff notes, we would say cliff notes, how you should interpret the Bible. And he feared, King James, that it could somehow undermine the church authority and his personal authority, okay? Because King James introduced this conservative Protestantism. Anglican Church, it's conservative version of Protestantism. So hence the King James Bible, where these end notes or side notes you would not see, right? Those of you who read the King James Bible, you will not see these side notes. But as I said, Catholics also created this counter tradition, Jesuits setting up schools, Catholic schools, to combat Protestant propaganda. Okay, but the general rise of literacy all over Europe. Why do I tell you this? Why? Let me to explain to you. Okay, and that's when we come to our next part. I would say what is this? The second part of our today's discussion, enlightenment. So basically, as a result of Reformation, primarily in Northern Europe, of course, but partially in Southern Europe as well. Although in Southern Europe, see, the Catholic Church to some extent retarded tradition of literacy, but still through the Catholic propaganda, through setting up Catholic schools, the general literacy to some extent was also on the rise in Southern Europe. But primarily we are talking about the Northern Europe, when the Bible reading opened the doors to so-called Republic of Letters. See this expression I used in my on my slide, Republic of Letters. Okay, so we have a large pool of inquisitive people who were taught throughout several generations to ask questions. Very important, because in some other cultures and traditions, we do not have this habit of asking questions. So if you go, for instance, to Russian tradition or Chinese tradition, you do not see this habit of asking uncomfortable questions, interpret debates, culture of debates. Okay. As a result of Reformation, we also have the decline of traditional religions. When some educated people, I wouldn't say that they stopped going to church, but they started to looking for enlightenment on the side, beyond the church. Okay. So some of these people, educated people especially, or craftsmen, people in towns, they started to experiment with alternative spirituality. That's how we have the rise of occult knowledge. We have the rise of alchemy, which eventually gave rise to chemistry. We have the rise of astrology. So people try to gaze up at the world of God through the telescope. Okay. Because going to church was not enough. We want to do something else to reach out to the heaven. Okay. And eventually that gave rise to astronomy. So see, it's an interesting thing. We have scientific revolution on the rise where in primarily in Northern Europe in the 1600s, okay, when people started talking about so-called God's laws or natural laws. Okay, later they started talking about natural laws. Republic of Letters, these educated aristocrats and townspeople, descendants of craftsmen, okay, who wrote letters to each other, who were inquisitive enough to interpret the Bible, to critically look around themselves. Okay, see the skepticism. See Martin Luther, I'm sure he would have been literally upset when if he had known that that Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, would trigger this chain of for him unfortunate events which resulted in secularization of society. Okay, so people started looking for natural laws. They started to experiment with metals, with chemicals. Okay, they were looking for the philosophical stone, for the source of all knowledge. How do we explain the world? Okay, and that's when we have the rise of among educated people a movement called deism. De, it means in Latin double. When some of these inquisitive educated people, they said, yes, God had created the world, but he gave it to us for us to unlock miracles in this world. Okay, and as I said later, they started calling these miracles natural laws. So let's look for natural laws in this wonderful world given to us by God. Okay, and that's how we have this gradual rise of science, because science was originally a religious enterprise. So one of the ways to find out about the world of God. Okay, we're going to look at the heaven through the telescope. We're going to find about the world of God. We sit in the chemical lab doing these experiments, some alchemist experiments. So we are going to learn more about the world of God. Okay, but if nature has laws, natural laws, it means society also should have natural laws. Okay, Isaac Newton, who discovers the law of gravity, he believed that there was the law of God, the law of gravity. So I unlocked the miracle. One of the miracles unlocked by me, Isaac Newton, is this law of gravity. In fact, Isaac Newton was a very spiritual man. So his diaries and his letters were published, and we found out that he was dabbling in occult knowledge and spirituality. Of course, he was a church-going people, so he was working in these multiple ways. And he was talking about natural laws and nature. But some people said, if nature has natural laws, it means society also should have natural laws. Okay, let's look for natural laws in society. So how society should be organized? What is the good government? Is there any blueprint of a good government that all countries should follow? Is there any economic system which is like the best in the world, so to say, and we have to uncover this. So that was the quest. Let's uncover these lures. So we have a bunch of educated people all over Europe who said we need knowledge. We need to publish books about knowledge, about natural societies, and these were the folk who eventually published the Encyclopedia, printed by Denis Diderot, one of the Enlightenment writers in France in the 1700s. So we need to make people more educated. See, not about the Bible at this point, but about the world of God, see? We need to educate people not about the Bible, but about our society, about our nature, about natural laws. Okay, natural laws that had been given us to God, because the God is only the clock master who had created the world, and now he has nothing to do with this world. It was also the time when we have so-called middle class revolutions or Atlantic revolutions. First we have English Glorious Revolution that gave power to English aristocrats and rich townspeople, 4% of the population. We also have American Revolution, which went further, much further, that gave power at least to 20% of population. There's private property owners. Okay, of course not everybody got the power, but France, we have in France people going further. We have French Revolution, so revolt against the society of Middle Ages, revolt against the feudal order. So in France we have a revolution when the king was kicked out, beheaded. Okay, at first it had happened in England, of course. Then in France, 1789, the feudal aristocracy lost their lands. Okay, and here the 50% of the population. See, the French Revolution went further than the American Revolution. Here all males were enfranchised, so received rights, became citizens. In the US, only property owners, so which excluded males who didn't have property, slaves, American Indians, women. But in France, all males became citizens. The feudal order was gone, because in Middle Ages, under feudal regime, people were unequal. So aristocrats, they enjoyed more privileges. Church enjoyed more privileges. They couldn't be taxed. No taxes. They didn't pay any taxes. They also were tried by different courts. Okay, middle class people, common folk, they were tried by special courts. Okay, and of course they were treated harshly compared to aristocrats. So now we have a formal equality in society, established as a result of the revolution, French Revolution. But immediately people started asking a question. So we eliminated the feudal aristocracy, we eliminated formal inequality. We are all equal in the eyes of law, formally. But now, look, guys, we have a new type of inequality, and that's what radical elements in the French Revolution immediately noticed. Remember, they were called Jacobins, this radical militant segment of the French Revolution, Jacobins. So Jacobins, it's like a city working craftsmen, radical militant craftsmen who lived in cities. They became known as Jacobins because they used in Paris a club of Saint Jacob, a building confiscated from Catholic Church, where they like to hold the meetings. So hence this nickname, Jacobins. So Jacobins questioned the new, as they said, inequality. Okay, this rich and poor. They said, oh, it's unfair. Before we had this feudal inequality, but now, according to law, according to formally, we're all equal. But look at economic inequality. That was the major concern, and that's when the people started asking questions about economic inequality. That's when we have the first sparks of secular socialism. Okay, so we already right now, I'm going to talk about personalities which already introduced sparks of socialism, because they moved beyond the Christian paradigm. They moved beyond Christian metrics. See, Thomas Müntzer was part of the Christian metrics. So now we're going to talk about people who had nothing to do with formally with Christian religion. They made an argument, a secular argument, okay, about socialism, although they didn't call this socialism at that time. If you studied the French history of French Revolution, you know that there was a powerful movement during the French Revolution against the church, okay, because church was viewed as part of this feudal order, because church didn't pay taxes, church enjoyed a bunch of privileges, they had a lot of lands, and of course a bunch of folks from the classes of craftsmen and peasants wanted to help themselves by confiscating the church land. So there was an economic interest here, of course, a selfish interest to crack down on church property, to steal the church property, property aristocrats and church property. And a lot of lands of aristocrats, a lot of lands that belonged to church, indeed were confiscated by the revolution and distributed among the peasants and among the craftsmen, among so-called common people. Okay, hence the popular support of the revolution. So if you remember, if you read about the ideology of the French Revolution, you know that instead of religion, the radical elements in the French Revolution wanted to introduce so-called religion of reason. Religion of reason was viewed as lack of Christian religion and faith in science. Faith in science, in human reason, knowledge. See? Complete secularization. So some elements in Enlightenment who originated from Christian Reformation eventually evolved into this militant secularism. Okay? They became so skeptical about traditional religions, Catholic Church and their own Protestant Church, that it kind of took them further away from conventional religion toward atheism. Okay, so that is why a lot of people were a secularist or even atheists in the French Revolution. So some Jacobins wanted to establish a religion of reason when our religion would be science. And everything should be done according to science, because science is very powerful. It can bring light to the world and can empower human beings. Okay, so they call this religion of reason, and even to symbolize this religion of reason, they picked up a lady, one of the poor ladies of Paris, and carried her through the streets of Paris as the symbolic manifestation of the goddess of reason. And the local sculpture made a statue of this woman using her as a model. Okay, and this statue, the goddess of reason, was installed in the Cathedral of Notre Dame that was confiscated by revolution, so to symbolize the new religion of reason introduced by Jacobins. Okay, so basically the person whose name I'm going to bring to your attention, Gracchus Babeuf, he was the offshoot of this Jacobin militant trend. Okay, he was the one who even went further than Jacobins. Okay, he said it's not enough for us to topple down aristocracy. Now we have another task to resolve, to eliminate this economic inequality. Okay, a lot of people were against this, by the way. They said, yes, we eliminated aristocrats. I'm talking about France, but we don't need to go further, because to go further, it's silly. You cannot talk about equal outcomes. People are unequal by nature. Yes, we have to create equal opportunities for them. Give everybody equal opportunities, but we shouldn't defend equal outcomes. Okay, see, that's the major conflict was already set up Okay, because socialism that late emerged as an organized movement started to insisted on what? On equality of outcomes. So it's a big deal for socialism to make sure that people have, especially in militant socialism, to guarantee equal outcomes. Okay, not enough to introduce equal opportunities, but again, Babeuf, of course, he made a good case against this. He started to argue that, well, in a rich man child have more opportunities. A poor man child has less opportunities, like for education, for instance. So that's how he made a counter argument. Anyway, Gracchus Babeuf said, revolution is not complete. It's not good. Let's go further. Nah, we should confiscate the rich. We should eliminate them. Okay. Yeah, as you know, in European history, especially in modern times, when people are fighting for against the feudal aristocracy, they appeal to Roman and Greek legacy. So that is how you have a bunch of founding fathers in the United States taking up this Roman nickname. So Gracchus Babeuf was the son of his time, and he chose this nickname Gracchus. Remember Gracchus? It was one of the Roman characters, plebeian, as far as I remember, famous plebeian Gracchus, Tiberius Gracchus. Okay. So I'm a plebeian. So I'm the manifestation of the interest of plebeians. I'm defending interest of plebeians. Francois Noël Babeuf was of humble origin. His father was a soldier, but fortunately he had good family friends who gave money for him to get education. So he became basically an accountant. That was his job. He took an active part in the French Revolution, was a writer, wrote for newspapers. And eventually in 1796, he said, "You are stupid, you shouldn't stop where we are right now." Okay. French Republic is not enough. We have to turn this into this People's Republic of Equals. He proposed conspiracy of equals. Okay, that was his secret organization. He actually set up a secret organization. They met underground in caves. Okay, see, that's even though he never talked about God. In fact, he was against Christian religion. This guy, Babeuf, he was speaking about eliminating religion, conventional religion, but still they were meeting in caves with candles, which reminded these meetings of early Christians. See, it's another point I will be making in this course, how frequently people who denied conventional religion, they actually repeated the same things which had been done originally by Christians, okay, only filling these the new movement with their content, new content, okay, or new form. But still, you can see here the elements of this early Christian mythology that definitely served well to people, because a lot of common folk who, even though it wasn't a big organization, but still substantial enough for that time, about 1,000 people. And I'm sure some of the common folk were attracted by this flavor of underground activities, flavor of victims meeting in caves, hiding from the authorities. He was betrayed by a spy. One of the members of this conspiracy of equals betrayed him to the police, and eventually he was executed. All of these people who conspired against the government. At that time in France, they had the government of so-called Directoire. It's a 5 men who ruled the French Republic before Napoleon came to power. So he was arrested and executed. But what about his agenda? See, that's already a socialist agenda. He defended communal living. So we shouldn't live in private. We should share everything. See, again, like early Christians, we should share everything, although he didn't talk about religion. No private property. Money should be abolished. Everybody possesses the same property. So he was strong defender of this equal outcome. So if somebody has more than another person, it's not good. So we should speak against this. It's not right. People should be equalized. Your country should be over your family, not a loyal. Your loyalty should be to your country. Country equals, not to your family. Abolish traditional religion, as I said. And look, that's a very important. That's what later became one of the major, by default, one of the major foundational corners of this modern socialism. The state came to replace religion, okay? Because later socialists argued that public property should be everything, people should own everything together, public property instead of private property. But who are these people who watch out how this public property is organized? Who are these people who act on behalf of so-called common people? Who are these people who eliminate private property? It's a state. Supposedly the state or working class men and women, okay, but the state. But he literally said this, instead of religion, we need to believe in the state, in the power of the state, because state power should organize ours for this in a good society. See, state socialism, one of the major messages of so-called state socialism. Okay, so that's about the Enlightenment and how the French Revolution, which was, of course, the child of Enlightenment, although it's hard to say this, Enlightenment itself, to some extent, was the product of the French Revolution, and the Enlightenment was also the product of French Revolution. So, in fact, they were like feeding each other, this Enlightenment movement and the French Revolution. Okay, so that's how Enlightenment created these prerequisites for would-be socialism. Now let me briefly draw attention to something which later gave organizational shell for first socialist groups. It's a Freemasonry. Freemasonry in 1700s. I'm sure everybody heard a lot of fairy tales about Freemasonry. If you go to YouTube, you will see a bunch of conspiracy theories, which millions of people, and for as strange as it may sound to the present day, share about Freemasons, that supposedly they were perpetrators of this conspiracy against the humankind. But again, as any stereotype, this particular stereotype about Freemasons, it has something to do with reality, although reality was distorted in the eyes of this conspiracy theorists. So let's briefly take a look at this. Remember, in Middle Ages, people in towns and cities belonged to guilds, and these guilds, craftsmen, defended their skills, defended their trades. They kept, some of them protected the secrets of their craftsmanship. Okay, they were very anal about it. To become a member of the guild was a big deal for an apprentice. Okay, so he had to graduate to produce a masterpiece in order to be admitted in a guild of shoemakers or bakers or whatever. Or masons, because originally the League of Masons, Guild of Masons, was a guild of professional masons who traveled all over Europe. See, interesting thing. So they, by default, Masonic leagues, they were cosmopolitans who traveled from one area of Europe to another, hired by aristocrats to build these beautiful church buildings, or like communal buildings, or like city halls. Okay, so they had to be very skilled people, and eventually, somehow, and you can go to special books about Freemasonry. Eventually, these leagues of guilds of Masons, they started to admit more and more, I would say, intellectual Masons, intellectual members, okay, writers, intellectuals. I guess the reason they did it because they themselves were highly trained people, and many of them, these Masons, real Masons who practiced Masonry, they were by default educated people, okay? So it wasn't necessarily they changed the face by admitting people who were not professional Masons, but they themselves were already intellectuals. So to make a long story short, in the late 1600s, in early 1700s, we have these guild of Masons gradually evolving into intellectual clubs, becoming intellectual clubs. Okay, people who started talking about practicing rituals, craftsmanship, which had nothing to do with actual Masonry. Okay, basically it became a secular religion that united people who belonged to this Republic of Letters, highly educated people who wanted to change the world, who were thinking about how world should be transformed. Okay, and they were not anti-God, but they viewed God as this great architect. See, that's the symbol of this Masonry, like a stereotypical symbol of Masonry, like the eye of God looking at us, and compass and geometrical symbols here. It's this to emphasize the human reason, science, enlightenment. See, so we are going, yes, we believe in God, but we do not picture God like these crude people sitting on a cloud, this bearded man who kind of pulls the strings. God is something that an abstract. Okay, it's a force. It's a great architect. The great architect who had created the world, but it's now to us to explore this world. Remember, deism. And we need to improve this world because the God gave us these natural laws. But still, there was a lot of religious rituals in this among these Masons, because they practiced this elaborate rituals of admission, different grades, degrees of Masonry, okay, which catered to the interest in spirituality among the people. So let me put it this way: it became a sort of secular religion that united the most educated people of Europe and North America at that time. You know that some founding fathers were also Masons. Okay, it's like elite intellectual clubs. Okay, and they preach toleration of all faiths. So Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, all we don't differentiate. Okay, because we were killing each other about God during Reformation so many times, so we are fed up with this. We shouldn't fight about God, because God is the same. It could manifest itself through in different forms, in Islamic form, in Buddhist form, in Christian form, but it's the same. And again, the big deal for Masons was reason, science. Okay. And that's how I guess this stereotype had emerged, because a lot of people at that time, I repeat, now of course it's just exotic clubs, you know, like something like Unitarian Church, you know, where people get together, they have this flavor of esoteric teaching, you know, and that's it. So the Masonry in our days, it's not what it had been at that time. At that time, indeed, it was a powerful intellectual movement, both in Europe and North America, that united these folk who believed in progress, in science and reason. Okay, and that's where the first socialists found their shelter among the Masons. By the way, one man who survived execution Gracchus Babeuf, who was executed. Babeuf and his friends were executed as conspiracy equals. Only one man survived. He was an Italian. His name was Buonarroti. So he could not be executed because he was an Italian subject. I forgot which kingdom he was. I think Neapolitan kingdom. So one of the Italian kingdoms. As a foreigner, he couldn't be executed. So he was expelled from the country, from France. So, and he took this job to tell Europeans about this conspiracy of equals. And by the way, it's through the book of Buonarroti that we know about Babeuf. So all the major information I'm sharing right now and whatever you find in Wikipedia and history books, it comes from his book, published in, I think, 1813, Buonarroti, about the conspiracy of equals. So this guy, Buonarroti, he started to travel all over the world preaching this, I would say, elementary socialism. He didn't call it yet socialism. He called it teaching about equality. Okay, we should be equal. And he found a shelter in Germany, in one of the Masonic clubs. Okay, so he became a famous Mason, and he recruited, swayed many Masons from his group in favor of socialism later, this guy Buonarroti. So that's how it affected, that's how Masonry contributed to socialism. Okay, in what happened in Buonarroti happened in many other parts of Europe. In France, for instance, the first socialist organizations, they grew out of Freemason clubs, okay, 1820s, 1830s, or they were part of Masonic clubs. Okay, some of them did not separate. Some Masonic clubs did not separate themselves from socialist groups, or the first socialists, which emerged in England and in France in 1820s, 1830s, they did not separate formally themselves from Masonic clubs. So, keeping this double membership. Now we're going to discuss the last point on our agenda today. It's the Industrial Revolution. Very important. Most important thing, because the Industrial Revolution, something that had started in England and then spread to Northern Europe, continental Northern Europe, and a little bit to Southern Europe, not much. You can see this map that shows you the major factories, the mines, the birth of Industrial Revolution, 1760s, 1820s. Okay, why is it? Why the Industrial Revolution is so important for us? It's because we have, as a result, through the Industrial Revolution, and as a result of, in the wake of Industrial Revolution, we have the emergence of new classes of people, industrial working class, that later was made into major class of socialism, especially in Marxian socialism. So working class people became like a noble savages of socialism. So they were treated as the class of people who were to change the world. Okay, so Industrial Revolution gave us a new class of people who later were embraced by socialism, especially Marxian socialism, as the major class that should change the world. So that is why we're talking about Industrial Revolution. That is why it's important for us here. Okay, as I said, Industrial Revolution emerged in England. Again, by chance. Everything happens in our world by chance. People do their private things, you know, whatever they do, they think they do good things. Some of them people think they do bad things, but something happens out of these. You know, out of bad things, good things happen. Out of good things, bad things happen. Or just things happen. So nothing is predictable. So there was something that later historians call the Industrial Revolution. So in England, wool manufacturers, they practice so-called putting out system, distributing the wool among these ladies who at home, peasant ladies, who manufactured clothing, or manufactured fabric. Okay, wool fabric that later was turned into clothing. So these women were given these piles of wool, and they worked these piles of wool into material. Okay, but India, English colony, competed heavily with Britain. There was a huge competition from between India and England over textile manufacturing. Okay, and since India was the most populous country, in addition to China, it had a lot of manual labor, so Indians could produce more material than wool manufacturers of England. Okay, there were more people to work with hands, and using cotton they produced more clothing, more materials. So manufacturers of England who worked with wool, they had to think, use the noodles, how to compete with India. So, and that's eventually how Industrial Revolution was jump started. These folk who were called manufacturers or factors, they started bringing these ladies and putting them under the same roof to work with, to produce more material. Okay, they started to introduce machines. That's how the first machines were introduced, like spinning jenny and so forth and so forth. So instead of doing this putting out system, we are going to bring this wool or cotton later from same colony, India. We would bring cotton, and these ladies in the big buildings from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. they would be working this wool or cotton into material that would be used to manufacture clothing. Okay, so people in factories, they had to work collectively. I want to emphasize this this factor, because it became very important, especially in Marx and socialism, when people, workers, working together collectively. Okay, one of the messages of would be Marx and socialism, that by working together, working class people, they would develop this common consciousness, rebellious consciousness, that would take them to the streets and make them revolt against the oppressive system. So that was the argument. So at first it was women, by the way, women, people who were the first working class people. Okay, ladies, young ladies primarily, who were recruited to work at the factories under the same roof. They were paid on fixed scale. They were making more money than their sisters who remained in the countryside. Okay, but the change was dramatic, and some of them loved to move into the cities because the life, at least on weekends, could offer them more opportunities. But at the same time, the work was backbreaking, a long work day. Okay. But our major point here is that a bunch of people were brought together to work under the same roof. So lifestyle, change in lifestyles. We have the growth of the cities. Again, we have railroad industry eventually coming to picture. Okay, in addition to women, we have a railroad workers' man coming to the picture. Okay. In the hindsight, I would say that Industrial Revolution was a liberating experience, because as a result of the Industrial Revolution, people received more goods because of the division of labor, mass production. So by working with hands, you could not produce so many goodies. And that's what upset a lot of traditional craftsmen or hand weavers. They didn't like, they hated these girls, and they hated these manufacturers who brought them. Okay, because they drove them out of business, that hand weavers or craftsmen. Okay, average living standards increased. Okay, and by the way, in Middle Ages, garments were so available that even the garments of plague victims were stolen by people. Shoes were stolen, because that's how precious were the garments, pants, shirts, and shoes. Not anymore, because Industrial Revolution could produce mass of the bulk of shirts, bulk of pants, bulk of shoes, you know, millions and millions of pieces. Okay, average living standards eventually increased because the food was also produced. So we're talking about textile industry because it triggered the industrial revolution. But later we have the same factors that processed meat. So we have more food, we have more bread because there were big bakeries which mass-produced loaves of bread, and women who moved to the cities, they were not dependent anymore on the traditional lifestyle of, would feminists say, male patriarchy. So they became very much independent people, relying on themselves. Okay, so that's what made some people happy. Who were people who were happy? Of course, manufacturers were happy. That were the happiest people, middle class, who organized manufacturing. And by the way, some of these manufacturers, many of these manufacturers, maybe most of them, they were not aristocrats. They came from these humble background, who started their businesses, who jump-started whatever, their factories, okay? And they made it up from a humble origin, but they did benefit. So people whom we can call the middle class or bourgeoisie, the Marxist would have said, okay? But and some workers, of course, were happy, okay? Who some ladies who wanted to escape this traditional countryside, okay? Young ladies, because they were attracted by the city life. But that's not how people viewed cities and factories and industrial revolution at that time, okay? We have to emphasize this. At that time, maybe majority of people, I would say majority of people, viewed industrial revolution as a horrible thing, as the horrible disruption of regular human life, disruption of traditional order, okay? And that's how this misery thesis was born, that people who moved to cities, they were miserable. They lived this horrible lifestyle. So if you compare their life with this pastoral life of peasants who lived close to nature, so workers, they are miserable people. So the whole industrial lifestyle is something that should be eliminated. It's not good for our nature. And especially conservatives, by the way, propagated this thesis. Aristocrats, so aristocratic conservative writers who hated this satanic mills. That's how they called the factories. These textile factories, whatever, iron manufacturing factories, any kind of factories, and especially if these factories had chimneys. So these romantic English people, some aristocrats, conservatives, they called them satanic mills. And in fact, the person who introduced this expression, satanic mills, was the English poet William Blake. He was the first to use this expression, satanic mills. And you can learn about how people lived at that time, or at least how industrial revolution was viewed by people at that time, by reading Charles Dickens' Hard Times, right? So there was a perception among many aristocrats and peasants, by the way, a lot of peasants, male peasants, that people were loose in cities. These girls, they were loose. And all people who moved in cities, they were miserable. And we also know about Luddites. Luddites, it were gangs of these peasants, males, who hated factories, who, under the cover of night, tried to set up factories on fire. Who killed the managers who handled factories, who managed factories, who killed manufacturers, or who were beating these girls who tried to go to work at factories. So in England, English government even had to call the troops to put down these riots of these Luddites, these crazy men who tried to wreck the equipment, to set the factories on fire. So it was a big deal at that time, okay? So anyway, so here is the image for you again to make a point that the first proletarians, as Marxists would say, or working class people, were these ladies who came to work at textile mills. And they were followed, of course, males who performed this hard labor in mines, on railroads, iron factories, and so forth and so forth. Okay. Satanic mills. But the point is, why is it so important for us? not only conservatives, these aristocrats who dreamed about old life, who had this nostalgia for old life, who criticized industrial revolution. There were a lot of workers who, even though they moved to cities, but still it was uncomfortable for them to feel this disruption of traditional lifestyle, who hated that the money they made, it was more than their brothers and sisters had in the countryside, but still it was less than this middle class people were making. Or like natural jealousy, they compared the lifestyle, or especially jealousy was when some people of the humble origin skyrocketed, became affluent people who accumulated riches, okay, became middle class people, and people asked natural questions. So why it was him, not me? There was a lot of bad blood between these middle class people and people who became known as working class people, proletarians, okay. There was also a threat of unemployment. That was the fear, because everybody wants his or her employment to be guaranteed, but at that time it was not guaranteed. There were no unions, and plus men were in countryside, I repeat, were upset that women were quote unquote become loose, okay. It was hard for people to get accustomed to their lifestyle. Plus there were a lot of traditional craftsmen who lived in cities, traditional craftsmen or hand weavers, who were people of Middle Ages. They also hated the Industrial Revolution, okay. Sudden changes, poor housing, overcrowded cities, okay, and a basic sanitation was missing. So all these notions, they upset not only these aristocrats, conservatives, romantics who had nostalgia about old pastoral England or France, if it happened in France, but also some elements in society who said, wait, we shouldn't eliminate the factors because factors are good, but we should use these factors, or we should organize them the way that to make sure that everything is fair. The working day is not so long, because the average work day at that time lasted from 12 to 16 hours. So in my slide somewhere here I mentioned 12 hours, but in some areas of Europe it reached 15 hours average working day, okay, except weekend. People didn't have any free time, no free time. So what we have here, we have this sense of frustration, not among everybody, because some workers actually dreamed about becoming middle class people. They actually used these middle class people who made it up in this life as role models, but there were a lot of working class people who didn't like them, who wanted either change the lifestyle or they wanted to improve their lifestyle, okay, who wanted to band together into what later became unions, who wanted to reduce the working day, okay. And that's what created the sense of discontent among these urban folks, who on the one hand wanted to work in the factories, but at the same time they wanted to improve the lifestyle or improve the working conditions, okay. And these were the people who later became, like, would say, the foot soldiers or the social base for the socialist movement, okay. These urban workers who felt, especially those segments of urban workers who were discontent, who were upset about the lifestyle, okay. And by the way, a lot of these workers not necessarily were workers in second or third generation, okay. Many second and third generational workers in fact held as a role model the middle class people, but recent people who recently moved from the countryside, who especially felt this dislocation, who felt this frustration, who had this problems with adjusting themselves to city life. So they became the most militant critics of factory conditions, okay, because for them it was not only about this gap between rich and poor, it was also about a sense of being upset about the whole lifestyle, which they had a hard time to adjust to, Okay, so anyway, to make a long story short, here we have these prerequisites for the general rise of socialism, and the next time we're going to discuss the first socialist groups. We will be going to talk about so-called utopian socialism. Thank you for your attention.